It's interesting being an artist where you are making something because you are compelled to make it. I think that's a thing that artists feel, that it's not a choice. It is a compulsion, that you feel lost and truly fucked up when you are not making things. So much of being an artist is selling your identity, is the commodification of your spirit for the consumption of others. And I think that we live truly in a deeply oppressive, patriarchal, white supremacist society. And that creates a really complicated landscape for women, and I think especially women in the arts.
Hello, sweet friends. Welcome back to Unbroken Chain. This is episode 15 and the first episode of 2019. That is the glorious Eliza Hardy-Jones, both singing and talking at ya. And I'll give her a more proper introduction in just a minute. But I do first want to give a quick shout out to the MindPod Network, run by Noah Lampert. They recently picked up Unbroken Chain and have been taking it to the people. I'm really grateful to be in good company there with a lot of sweet thinkers and cosmos explorers. And I also recently had the pleasure of being on Noah's podcast, Synchronicity, and I talked to him about an art-making, medicine-taking, women celebrating, terrifying, beautiful, expansive adventure that I went on this last summer. So more of my story there if you're curious. And as you've probably noticed from these conversations, plant medicine's very near and dear to me, and the more we can share with each other about their ability to heal and transform culture, the better. So check that out, MindPod Network, Synchronicity. Really grateful to Noah Lampert for making me part of the family. And I also want to ask you for a quick favor. If you're enjoying these podcasts and you want to hear more, it would be so helpful if you'd hop over to iTunes and leave a sweet little review. It just helps boost the signal and helps more of us wild, sweet weirdos find each other out here. So thank you. I really appreciate it. So today, Eliza Hardy-Jones, who is a badass artist, it just comes out of her in many different forms. And as she explains, she is not afraid to say what she thinks, and it's really infectious. Eliza and I met up in Philly just after the new year, and she was extremely generous in sharing a lot of her process in her art making, and also a lot of her personal journey and how she's come to understand herself. She definitely celebrates the contribution of women who have been largely unsung in many of the stories about our national and cultural identities, and really the story of how our species evolved. And she does a really beautiful job offering some new lenses for our collective story about ourselves. She also cracked me up so much, and I think she'll do the same for you. So here she is, a true wild woman and kindred spirit, Eliza Hardy-Jones.
I am a musician and a textile artist. I say I'm a textile artist to people when I want them to take me seriously, but it just means that I'm a quilter.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily seem like those two things would overlap, but with you specifically, I feel like they're almost one and the same.
They definitely do overlap. Yeah, they come from, I think, different pieces of my personality. Currently, I'm working on this project that very much overlaps those two things, and the marriage of those two things is super important. But for a long time, I went on tour, and then when I came home, I would make quilts because it's a way to have purpose to my day. You know, I think when you're a touring musician, you don't necessarily get to come home and fall back into a productive routine because your life is unpredictable. So it's hard to then come home to some productive structure. So being able to come home and be well, I'll just sew for 8 hours today. And then at the end of the day, I'll feel this sense of purpose and accomplishment, and I'll feel connected to myself in a really private way after having been on tour where I have been connected to other bodies for 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
In a really intense way. So like that very personal endeavor was always sort of a nice balance. But yeah, right now I'm working on a song quilt project. So it's both things. Yeah.
Yeah. What is that? What is that project all about?
So the idea is that I've been traveling around in two sort of specific traditions, the Arctic traditions in Russia. So I went up into Arctic Russia, and then in the United States, I've been originally I thought I'll go do the Russian North and the American South, but it's grown to encompass other regions. But the idea is that I meet with women, they share with me folk songs, so songs from their different traditions, and hopefully also share with me some stories and about their lives and about what role the song has played in their lives. And then I make exact transcriptions. So I came up with a method where rhythm becomes shape and color is pitch. Wow. And so then I create exact transcriptions of each of the songs, and then I quilt them with regional textile designs. So the Russian song quilts are quilted with maybe a weaving design from the village where the song came from, or maybe it's a design that's specific to the woman and not necessarily the region. So each of the quilts, I try to bring the woman into the quilt beyond just the transcription of the song itself.
So if someone had your decoder ring, they could theoretically...
Yes.
Wow.
I mean, I think a lot of times when people talk about, like, I made a quilt about a song, it's not necessarily literal. These are literal. So it is just like there is a key. Like I can look at them and sing them to you. There are certainly ways in which my notation method is inexact. Like there's no way of differentiating octaves. So like if a melody goes from the 1 to the 2 to the 6, I can't tell you whether it's going 1, 2, and then up to 6, or 1, 2, and then down to 6. So there's that level of sort of inefficiency in my notation design. So I don't think it will replace the current notation methodology that musicians have landed on. But in terms of creating an aesthetic piece that I think is both informative, but also, to me, it's really beautiful. It looks, and to be able to look at rhythms and to look at pitches and to look at how folk music is sort of these patterns of rhythms and pitches. And I think a lot of times when you're hearing a song, you don't necessarily hear the totality of the song, so you're not hearing those patterns right away. To be able to just look at a song in its totality all at once and see the patterns all at once and to see how it shifts and moves all at once, to me was a really fun idea and something that I was interested in seeing. So I made them.
It sounds like synesthesia almost.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that like brought me to this project, but one of them is that my grandmother, my grandma Mary, who was a big inspiration in my life, she was a true wild woman, true bohemian. She had synesthesia. So growing up, she lived in Virginia for a while, like way out into the woods. And then as I got older, she lived in a small town called Scottsville. In her life, she had developed a method of teaching violin through color theory.
What?
Which essentially she thought that a 3 or 4-year-old doesn't know their letters. So you can't even like go to the step of just like, oh, here's, your notes that you can read, because you can't tell them what an A is because they can't read an A yet, but they understand color. So if you say the first note of this song is red and then play red on your violin, the kid could understand that. So she would do these first-time fiddler workshops that I taught with her. So my sort of early teens into my adulthood, I would teach first-time fiddlers workshops. I cannot play the fiddle. I'm really not good at it, but I can like fake it for a 4-year-old. But yeah, so that door was already open to me. And that's, although I would love to believe my grandmother is like a unique genius, there are lots of people who have explored what is called color music. Scriabin wrote entire scores in color. There's lots of either musicians who have tried to like reimagine how notation has worked, and then a lot of artists who are trying to reimagine, something that they hear into something that you can see. So I would say that my project is in a line of traditions. It's my own. I made it, I made up the methodology myself, but it's certainly that seed was already planted in me.
Yeah, I want to ask you what folk means to you, because I feel like the process that you've invented and that your grandmother invented sort of is that folk spirit of self-taught artistry. The visual art that I like the most is folk or naive, but what does that mean? Is that being defined by the mainstream?
Yeah, that's really interesting too, because I think in the American popular music canon, when we say folk music, we think Peter, Paul, and Mary. And that's not what I mean. What I mean is traditional music. One of the parameters for my project is that I will only do notations of songs that have no provenance. So I don't want to be able to trace it back to the person who wrote it. Frequently, when I meet with women, they'll sing me, a handful of songs, maybe a dozen songs, and some of them are, more recent compositions, but a lot of them are things that we just don't really know where they came from. We don't know when they were codified into the versions that they are, and that's one of the things that fascinates me most about what I'm calling folk music, but traditional music, is that it's not until our modern era that those songs become set in stone. That up until that point, when the Folkways recordings were sending the Lomaxes down south and saying, okay, go and find this great American tradition, right? There's this incredible wealth of music that is purely American, and as we, face this new era as Americans, how are we going to define ourselves? By our art and by our music? So let's go find those truly American songs. That there would be, if you think about that song, Mom's little baby like shorten it. There's like 50 versions of that song. With that melody, with a different melody, with ultra offensive lyrics, with totally sanitized lyrics. Like, it's so, so different. And then it's just that, like, at some point, somebody makes some piece of a value judgment that says, like, this version is really interesting, and it gets recorded. And then because it's recorded, it gets learned by more people, and then more people are using that kind of a version of it. And so even, I play traditional old-time American music, and frequently people say, like, oh, what version of Ida Red are you going to do? And there are, even now, a handful of Ida Red versions. And you kind of have to be able to, like, roll with it as you go back and forth. But it's still sort of in the same realm. But I love the idea that, like, over time these songs have been telephoned. And I don't really know what those songs used to mean. And I think in the modern era, they have become something because of what they mean to us and our identity. So part of my excitement about the project was thinking about how we use folk traditions, textile traditions, quilting traditions in particular, and how we use traditional music and folk music to sort of like draw a circle around what we understand about our identity. And with this project, I'm specifically thinking about women's contribution to that. So like what it is that women create and put into the world that is often attributed to male traditions.
Yeah.
But that comes from this like wealth of things that marginalized people or forgotten people have brought to the world. And then we sort of attribute like, well, American identity is this cult of the forefathers, right? He's got these like 12 white dudes and they like built this country totally by themselves. And like everything is about following their will and their whim because they were like perfect, pure geniuses. And anytime we like stray from Thomas Jefferson's great golden idea that like we're not American anymore, when that's not really how we understand ourselves as Americans. We understand ourselves by this layering of traditions that gets telephoned over and over again, and it's where we draw our circles that we begin to understand ourselves. And a really similar thing happened in Russia in the Soviet era, where you had this imperial tradition, and then when the Soviets came in, they were really interested in total renewal of identity, right? That the whole idea was like, we as comrades, as morally superior, we are this new human revolution, and what we are going to do as this new human revolution is we're going to show the world this beautiful thing that we have here as Soviets, as Russians. And so a lot of the Soviet era was about pouring incredible amounts of resources into the arts, which is why you think about like the Bolshevik ballet and the Moscow theater and the, you know, the classical composers coming out of that era of the Soviet tradition, the painters, the authors, the poets. That was all there because the Soviets for a long time felt like art is the most important cultural export. And if we are the best, if we are making the most beautiful things, the purest things, the things that move humanity, then surely the communist experiment has been a success, right? Which is like, talking about it, I'm like, oh, I'm getting goosebumps. Like, that's an amazing idea. Of course, then you just have a bunch of powerful men who decide what that means and decide where you draw that circle and decide like, okay, this artist is a true Russian artist, and so we're going to protect them and fund them and support them and build this up. And then this other dude, we're going to send to the gulag, and he's going to shut up because we're not interested in his voice because it doesn't conform with what we think about our identity. And that's in particular what excited me about going up to the Arctic was that it was outside of the Moscow power capital, that it still had this, you know, incredible tradition. And there's something about being in the north with all the ice that has, you know, sort of geographically protected some of those traditions. And even in the Soviet era, those traditions were very, very important, and there was resources and investment put into preserving, much like the Lomaxes in the American South. There were a group of women, almost entirely women, who went into the villages and into the rural areas of the Arctic and just found all of the best women, because all of the women were the people doing all of the art up in the Arctic, and brought them to the cultural centers of the North and created choirs and, you know, like textile groups and all of these things to say, like, look at this incredible wealth of culture that we have up here. And although the Muscovites are ignoring us and pretending like it's not part of our great Russian heritage, there was still support and investment in that tradition. And so it has remained alive and vital. Like, you don't have to, like, dive deep and find an 85-year-old woman to find these. Like, it's just around.
What do you find there these days?
Well, it's really interesting. You know, it's a modern European nation, so you find a lot of the same things that you would find in any of the industrialized nations. I was in 2 cities in Russia. I spent a little bit of time in Moscow, and then I went up to Arkhangelsk, which is technically in the subarctic, which means it doesn't have a true polar night. And then in Murmansk, which is in the Arctic, which means they have 4 months of darkness. True polar night. Just 4 months of the sun will never, ever rise.
That's got a deeply informed culture.
Oh my God, it's so cool. It's so, so cool. And Murmansk is specifically interesting because it was founded by the Soviets to be a Soviet utopia. So there was not, like, Arkhangelsk is a city that has been there since the 13th century. Murmansk was just smatterings of villages here and there, and then the Sami people, which are the sort of like indigenous people who live in the Arctic. And you had some like nomadic rural villages of settlers, but you had no, you know, center. Whereas in Arkhangelsk was actually the first big capital that St. Peter, you know, that Peter the Great had founded. But then he got there and he was like, oh my gosh, it's freezing here. And the port is like frozen over for 4 months. Like, this isn't a great, because Arkhangelsk is a port town. It was like, we can't actually be an international shipping port if we can't get the ships in here. So he moved it south to St. Petersburg. Mm-hmm. So you think of like St. Petersburg as this like incredible northern capital. Arkhangelsk is like 20 hours north of that. Wow. And then Murmansk is 24 hours north of Arkhangelsk on a train. So I took the train Arkhangelsk to Murmansk. And Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, because of the reasons of their foundation, are ultra different. Arkhangelsk feels like a small provincial capital. So it's got a downtown industrial center. There are cafes, there are venues, there's an art museum. The things that you would expect from a place that's just been there forever. Arkhangelsk has tons of craftspeople and painters. One of the places that I went was the Children's Folk Art School, And these kids are doing basket weaving, like really intricate traditional loom weaving. They do these like wooden carvings that are then painted with the 27 different specific regional cultural designs. So each of the kids will learn each of the 27 regional designs and then like paint them on these different carvings and things. And then the other class they have is quilt making. And I was expecting like, okay, the quilts will be this very different tradition, but it's literally like you go in there and it's a log cabin quilt and a grandma's basket quilt and a pine burr quilt. And I'm telling them this, like, this is a pine burr quilt. And they're like, no. That's very specific to this town and this region. I said, yeah, no, it's like in Alabama too. They do a lot of pine burr quilts. And they're like, no, you don't understand.
What's going on there?
I think a lot of it was that quilting became a popular pastime in the 18th, 19th century. So there was already so much colonial movement of like, you know, people going from Germany to the Americas to South America to this to that. And so I think some of those designs just made their ways around. And although, you know, Arkhangelsk and Murmansk are geographically isolated, you can still walk from Murmansk into Norway. So it's not like these people didn't have access or...
People are sharing ideas.
Yeah, there was a lot of that sharing of ideas. So I think a lot of this idea of, this quilting tradition that's been around forever, they have old quilts like we have old quilts. They have quilts that are 150 years old. And then I'm not exactly sure what happened before then. The weaving tradition is very, very old. So like there are 14th century examples of the same pattern that are now still being woven in these places.
Do you find that women specifically are the carriers of this signal?
Yes. There's a great book called Women's Work, The First 10,000 Years. It's a great book and everybody should totally read it. And it's beautiful and really empowering in that the author essentially makes this argument that like when we think about human civilization, so often men are given the credit for the creation of civilizations, right? That like the consolidation of power and the, you know, being able to build pyramids, and men were out there like hunting saber-toothed tigers and the women were just like these fragile creatures and they like planted some plants, whatever, but that like men were truly, you know,
they're the innovators.
Men were the innovators. And this book makes the argument that there is certainly some biological imperative, right? That like that women were forced to be more sedentary because of breastfeeding. So you can't continue the lineage if you can't feed your child. So it's less about that like men were powerful so they went and hunted, and more that men were useless so they went and hunted.
Wow.
Because like we didn't need them. So, okay, well, you can go out and like get us some big game and that'll be helpful. That would be a helpful thing for you to do. So go out and do that thing while we build societies. And so the idea is that like women were forced to be sedentary, and then that created the transition from nomadic tribes to settled areas. And once you have those settled areas, you started to have trade, and that it's in fact textile that's the first currency. It's the first language. So pictographic weavings are the first ways in which language is being shared between two different people. And that idea of creating a currency and creating a language is the basis of civilization. And if the people creating those things are women, if the people who made those innovations of spinning and who were able to, you know, build those things up is women, then women are in fact the people who built civilization. That men had a role in it and an important role in it, but if you just look at like what is the piece that shifted us from a nomadic species to a civilized species, it's the creation of textiles, that changed everything. So when you go in and you see these girls doing these like incredible weavings that has been done that way for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, this is really powerful. Like, oh my gosh, this is amazing.
Yeah, you're giving me goosebumps.
I know, it's really cool. But the original question was, is it all women engaged in these traditions? Definitely not. In Russia, one of the interesting things was one of the groups that I interviewed for the quilt project was the Northern Academic Russian Folk Choir. So it's this sort of like choir that was founded in the 30s. And I sat in for a rehearsal, and it's an 80-person ensemble. Every singer is a woman. There are men in the group, but they are just there to dance. And there's some of it is just singers making the music, and then some of it there's like a band of musicians, and some of the musicians are men too. So like the accordion player was a guy, the balalaika player was a guy, but women are singers in the Arctic. So for me, it wasn't like, well, there's this guy who's singing this incredible song, but I'm like focusing on women. In the States, that's really different. I think in the United States that men are frequently those who are in control of the musical power centers.
Which you would see in institutions?
Yeah. So like if you think about like who are the great innovators of traditional American music, you're going to talk about men. You're going to talk about Leadbelly and Bill Monroe and Flat and Square. Like if we're talking about that kind of traditional music, all of those names are going to be men. If you look deeper, you will find women in those traditions. And so there's this sort of like, well, is it that men were the keepers of the tradition, or was it that men in power were asked to create a record, and so they went to men to create that record? And that then as radio became just a huge cultural force in the United States, and radio really changed culture for Americans all over, the women have always been the sort of exception. And that continues today. Like, I can't tell you how many, like this year, it's like everyone's like, oh, this year's the year of the women. Like, women are coming out of nowhere. I can't believe it. Like, did you know women made records? And it's like, yeah. And then, like, I watched that show on Netflix, the 90s, and they were like, the 90s were great. Like, women all of the sudden were just making records. Like, nobody could believe it. Women just had these, like, important messages that people cared about. It's like, oh, my God. Women were always making music. They were always making important music that people always cared about. Like, you can't go back to a time where you're like, well, but if you really go here, like, you just don't hear women's voices. You always hear women's voices. They're always changing music. They're always pushing, boundaries, and they're always asking us important questions. But just, like, in our collective memory of it, we're like, this is the first time ever that women made records. And on one hand, I'm so happy that there's a discussion right now about all the amazing women who made amazing records this year, because there should be. They rule. Those records are awesome. But to pretend like this is the first time ever, it drives me insane.
Yeah.
So it's a little more complicated in the States, because both men and women have always been involved with public music.
Right. Did you see a parallel between the Arctic and the American South that kind of just naturally presented itself, or did you feel like the South was the place to look for those voices?
The provenance of the project was that I put As a Woman made a record. Can you believe it? I made a record that came out in early 2016, and through the power of the internet, my record made its way onto Russian Facebook.
No shit.
Right?
Whoa.
Who knows why? And a painter named Daria Orlova, look up her paintings, they're so amazing, who lives in Murmansk, was doing a painting exhibition about shadows. And my album cover, there's a picture of my body and the shadow of my body, but the shadow of my body does not match what my physical body is doing. And she was like, oh, what an interesting picture, and then listened to the music, and I think there's a lot of themes about that idea on the record. And so she wrote me a letter and was like, I really want to talk to you about your ideas about shadows. Also, I have this exhibition coming up. Can I use your music for it? And I wrote her back, and I was like, yeah, dude, that's awesome. Like, how in the world did you hear my record? That is so fun. And then, like, a couple of days later, a different woman messaged me and said, Daria gave me, your contact, and she played me your music, and it's really cool, and I run the Arctic Art Foundation, and she's like, I would just really love to talk to you about collaborations. And at the time, I was on tour with Grace Potter and had, like, all kinds of things going on in my own head about my own art. And so, like, just sort of this, like, call out of nowhere, I was like, I have this, like, really positive say yes vibe. I was like, say yes, call up that Russian lady, let's do this. So I like FaceTimed her from like the cab of the bus at 7 a.m. while everybody was sleeping. And she just started talking about the Arctic Art Foundation. She was like, yeah, it's a lot about like slow art and traditions and handwork. And and she was Katerina Shurova, who's one of the founders of the Arctic Art Institute, is so passionate about the place that she's from and about the value of those traditions. And she asked me, do you know anything about Russian folk music? And I said, well, my great aunt Virginia was an opera singer, and she had a Russian lover, a decades-long paramour, Andrei Salamov, who had left during the revolution with the Shov-Suri, which was this sort of like Russian cabaret theater, which was massive, like bigger than the Ziegfeld Follies, like just this huge theater troupe. They had made it big in Moscow and then got pushed out during the revolution because it wasn't like, you know, sanctioned Russian culture. Went to France for a while and then came over to the States. And Salama was the arranger for that, and he taught voice lessons. And my aunt lived in New York City, and she took voice lessons from him and fell deeply in love with him, and they had this loving affair. And in Russia, everybody in Moscow has these sort of like houses in the countryside called dashas. And they were driving outside of New York, and he saw what he believed was his dasha, which was just this little wood house in the Delaware Water Gap in North Jersey. He bought it. They named it Salamovka, and they would rent out rooms for the summer. And like all of these artists would be there, like classical musicians and painters and poets, and you know, and they're all sleeping with each other, drinking vodka, like, you know, doing all these wild things. And when he died, by the time he died, you know, it was, the Depression had come and gone. The Shov-Suri was totally obsolete. He basically had no money. So she had paid off the mortgage on Salamovka and had sort of become his benefactor. But when he died, all of his papers got left to her. And then they came to me. Wow. So my dad, right before I had left for tour, had shown up with this stack of Salamov's papers and had handed them to me and been like, you have to do something with these. And I, you know, was kind of this like, Dad, don't give me this, like, like, I'm busy. I'm doing a lot of things. And so when Ekaterina says, well, what do you know about Russian folk music? I was like, funny enough, I grew up singing these songs.
Wow.
You know, like, and, like, I know, like, in my head, I'm like, you know, like, I'm singing her the melodies of, like, da 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 da. And she laughs at me and she goes, oh, those are city songs, you know. But, you know, it was this amazing thing. And she goes, oh, that's really funny. And she said, well, you know, it's been so great to talk to you. If you think of a project that you want to do, we can host a residency for you here in Arkhangelsk. So then I kind of went away and I was thinking about what she was talking about, textiles and, you know, tradition and culture and identity and music. And I have this stack of papers and, like, this basic invitation to come there. But I have to have a good idea. Like, I can't just go there and be like, I'm here. What are we doing now? So I just came up with this idea and then called her back up and she was like, I love it. Make it happen.
God, I love those moments when all the ingredients of your life kind of come into this focal point of direction and intention.
Yeah. Yeah, it was great. It was
Wow.
super fun. And it definitely like had to be willed into creation. There was a lot of times where I think the universe was saying like, you can't do this. And I was just like, fuck you, universe. I will do what I want.
You are such a wild woman.
I know.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about that because I feel like that's so much of the signal of your solo work of that album from, is it 2016?
Yeah.
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 I just feel like you're saying like, I'm wild. It's okay. I see you. We're out here. Like, it's just... I'm so compelled by it.
Yeah, that's nice of you to say.
What was the inspiration behind that?
Well, for 10 years, I had been in a creative partnership with my childhood best friend, who was a man, who I love dearly, who is still a really important part of my life. But there became a point in that partnership where I just started to feel like I was always writing through his eyes. And not to say that I wasn't writing with my own voice, I was. And he and I both wrote songs and then we would bring them to each other and we would, you know, we had this band Buried Beds. And I don't look back on that and think I was a fraud and it was fake. I feel like that was me and that was those were real songs that I really wrote, that I meant to write. But they were always, you know, through the lens of I'm in a partnership with this person, and so I need to write through his lens. And I think he would probably say the same thing about me. You know, sometimes I would write a song and I'd be like, I love this song. And he'd be like, yeah, I don't care. It's not a Buried Bed song. You know, like, I like it too. This isn't a buried bed song. And I think that at a certain point felt sad to me, where I was like, I don't want to feel attached. I don't want to feel responsible. And I think being in a band, you're running a business, and I felt like I was running a business, and that felt at a certain point sad and oppressive, and I just didn't want it anymore. And then I felt terrible because, like, here's this person that means so much to me and who I love, and all the musicians that I played with were amazing. It was this wonderful chapter of my life, and just getting to a point of being like, I love this so much and I don't want to do it anymore. So getting to that point of writing the solo record was, what happens when there are no lenses? Like, what happens when I'm not creating something with an idea about what it means to somebody else? I would say I spent like 9 months writing shit songs. Like, so, like honestly, like I get together and be like, yeah, maybe I just don't know how to do this. Like, maybe I don't know, like, what is it? And I think because my interests are really diverse and varied, I think I wasn't exactly sure what and who knows what that means. I think my lens in, 2015 when I was writing and recording that record is really different from my lens now. But at that moment, it just like took some time to sort of lock in and define what it was. And I don't know that I can tell you what I defined it as, but like it just started to feel right, and then it felt great. It was like really exciting to rediscover some joy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I feel like you share so much of that process through the music. Like you have a song that's called Who Am I? Mm-hmm. And, I mean, you're sharing your process in discovery, which is incredible.
Yeah. That song, Who Am I, is specifically, I mean, it's a love song. It's a song for my husband, who I've been with now for 15 years,
wow.
Which is such an accomplishment and such an important part of my identity, right? It's like I met him when I was 23 years old, and so much of how I see myself is how he sees me, which I don't mean to say to be like disempowering, but it's just the truth. I mean, it's just how so that song is both a love song to him, because it's great to see myself through his eyes. He's like really into me, which is great. Like, one of the ways that I'm able to be bold and ambitious and wild is because I have this real sense of comfort of like, well, you know what, like this could all fail and then I could just go back to being married to Andrew. So that's powering. But there's also something about that of like, who am I without this person? And who are any of us? I mean, I think like we only know who we are through the lenses of how we see ourselves, but how do we choose those lenses? And why do we choose those lenses? I mean, so it was just sort of this, who am I? Mm-hmm. Who am I if you don't love me? Mm-hmm.
Since you're saying that, we kind of look for the places to find who we are outside of relationships, I was wondering what some of your creative practices are, or what some of the places that you go or the environments that you create to kind of find yourself.
Yeah. I have a studio in my house that I have built for me. And it's both the place where I create my quilts and also where I make music, which sometimes I find frustrating because I can't do both at once because it's a small space. So I have to like shut down the sew zone and like build up the recording zone. So I have that lovely spot in my home, which is a real gift. I think a lot of times not having that private space is a real hindrance to creative people, and being able to have that and to know that it's always there and it is not shared is really powerful. I also run every day, and I think that is a really vital creative space for me. When you're on tour, I was saying like, you're always around bodies 24 hours a day. And frequently on tour, you meet other people who run. Running is a fairly common activity. And people are like, oh, we should run together. And I'm always just like, no way. No. Run in the opposite direction from me.
You are not invited.
You are not invited. And I think a lot of times it's like early on in a tour where people are like, you're like trying to forge relationships. And I'm never just like, no, go away. I'm like trying to find a way to have that be friendly. But running is a really important creative place for me. It's where I process. I think running is important for me from a mental health perspective. I think that like helps me to manage anxiety and, chemical things. So I think it's important in that way. But also just like I write a lot of lyrics when I'm running, and I solve a lot of problems when I'm running. I think a big piece of creating anything is solving problems. Even with my quilt project, when I went to Russia, the way that they sing is different. And it almost sounds like an Indian tradition or a Middle Eastern tradition where you have these sort of like sliding pitches. And I was like, oh, okay, I feel like that's important. I feel like I can't just say that, they sang this note and then this note, that movement between the two notes is actually an important piece of this. So how do I create that slide? So instead of just like sitting in my studio, I go on a run and I think about it, and I think about the colors or the ideas. And so I think the running is an important creative space for me. I try to run in beautiful places. I think those are the times where that happens for me. I also, like this morning, I just ran on a treadmill and I had no creative process. I watched one of those home shows and it was great. I solved no problems. And I think that's important too, like to give myself the it was awesome. I did nothing. My brain was turned off for 45 minutes.
I totally relate to, because I fell in love with running in the same way. And actually, I found it's still very wily, that creative process, because I can't necessarily say I have X problem like you would with the quilt. I sort of have to open my brain to whatever it wants to work on.
Yeah.
And then I do find clarity coming through that I didn't expect, and not in the frantic kind of way of like, I have to write this down before it disappears. It's it's a knowingness that I bring back with me.
Yes. Yeah. I think a lot about that thing that happens in your brain when I don't know anything about science, so I can't talk about it, but like I think your brain is having like all of those like tree branches, and then when you get tired, each of the branches gets these little like globs of sleepiness on it. And that's how coffee works, is that the caffeine molecule attaches itself to a branch, so the sleepy glob can't attach itself. So you have this like caffeine thing like filling up your branches, but at the same time, now your branches still have shit on them. It has caffeine molecules on it, and then when you sleep, the branches release. So when you sleep, all of the globs fall off, and that's why you wake up refreshed, And I feel like when I run, my brain branches get shaken up in a really good way. In a really people are like, oh, you run all the time, you must be really good at it. I am like hardcore slow. I run like... I'm not trying to win any races. Like elderly people will like lap me and I'm fine with it. But I feel like it shakes my branches.
I like that. Yeah. Well, while we're talking about brain branches, I noticed one of the covers, I think it was the album that you did before your solo album, has mushrooms on the cover. It's like a woman creeping through the forest.
Okay, yeah, that's Baba Yaga. So this is like another wild synchronicity. That was the last record that I made with Buried Beds, and that record is called In Spirit, and each of the songs is inspired by essentially a fairy tale or a traditional story, or some of it started as like, oh, we'll write songs about fairy tales, but that also came to include songs about parallel earth theories and songs about, it was like fairy tales that were told to us when we were young and fairy tales that are told to us now. All songs that were inspired by allegories about how we choose to live. In the search for what visual things to pair with that, we found the artwork of Ivan Bilibin, who is from the Arctic of Russia. What? And who, in the late 19th century, made a series of incredible paintings all about Russian fairy tales, all about Russian folk stories. One of the most important of the Russian folk stories is Baba Yaga, who is a witch. And she lives in a house on chicken feet or crow's feet, depending on the thing. And she walks through the woods with a scepter that has a skull, and the skull eyes glow light into the forest.
Yes.
And so that's the cover. It's this like very innocent young woman holding this skull glow eye scepter with the Baba Yaga chicken house behind her, and then forest scenes. So the mushrooms are just unrelated to were there psychedelic mushrooms in the Arctic of Russia in the 19th century? Potentially.
Probably.
But they are those, like, you know, they do look like those cartoonish toadstool
totally.
mushrooms. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you believe in synchronicity, or it feels like there are a lot of connections in your life that you see and that you're going towards?
Yeah, it's a funny thing of I am both incredibly credulous, where like I just believe, like I believe in magic. But then there's another piece of me that at the very same time thinks everything is fucking bullshit. I feel comfortable living in both of those places. I'll tell you one more of the most magical synchronicities of all is that on my solo record, there's a song called Weatherman, and it's about a Soviet weatherman. There was a photo essay in The New Yorker of just a photographer had gone up. So there's no information. It's just about this weatherman who is up in some, you know, Arctic island with a lighthouse measuring the ice and the wind. And in the description of the photo essay, it describes him as saying something about loneliness and this idea of like, I'm not lonely because I am the wind, which I was like, oh my God, like how incredible is this? He has a wife, and that partnership is important to him, but he spends almost all of his time like, you know, with just like an old tap radio up in the Arctic. It was just this really beautiful thing. So I wrote this song about him and loneliness. And then when I got to Arkhangelsk, I spent a lot of time with Ekaterina and then with this incredible singer, Anna Akimova, who's mostly a jazz singer, and she booked a show. And so I had taught a class at the music college basically about the traditions of American folk music and how to break that down, sort of what are the things that make American folk music what it is. It's call and response and meter and lyrical content. And so I taught the class how to sing like 9 Pound Hammer and Kitchi Kitchi Kaimio and Whoopie Ai Tayo, Get Along Little Doggies, which was awesome having all of these like young Russian students sing these songs with me. And Anna had set up a show and she was like, great, we'll have the students do the traditional tunes, I'll sing some songs, and then you'll sing some songs. And I was like, great, what do you want me to sing? She was like, I'm not interested in American folk music. I like your music, I want you to sing your music. And I said, do you want to do a duet? And she said, yeah, I definitely want to duet. You know what song I really like is that song Weatherman. And she speaks English, but not great. A lot of this is like sort of through Google Translate. And I said to her, that's about this Russian guy. And she goes, no, not a Russian song, your song. And I said, no, it's about this weatherman. And I like pull up the article and I show them the guy's name. And she goes, oh, he lives here. He lives in Arkhangelsk. And I was like, no way. They were like, yeah, we know his wife. We'll call her and maybe she can come. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So then Anna translated the song into Russian and we did this duet where like I would sing it in English and she would sing it in Russian. We sang this song about this guy who essentially lives in this town way up in the Arctic of Russia, none of which had registered with me at all when I wrote the song, because I'm just looking at these pictures. I'm thinking about loneliness and what loneliness means.
Right.
And then, then it comes to be this thing that's about the antithesis of loneliness. You know, that like you find people everywhere. You find soul connections all over the place. And I feel like that, those soul connections are just so beautiful, where it's like you meet people that you feel that you already know deeply. And that's such a beautiful thing to encounter. So I believe in that, but then I'm also like, I don't believe in any of this.
Is that a defense mechanism, do you think? What was your childhood like around spirituality?
My mother is a great seeker. She is very spiritual, and I think that has served her. And I think that it has served me. And I think also she has really struggled and that it has not served her. When I was young, I was very ill. And I totally understand why she does, but I think felt frustrated and wanted me to be healthy and wanted to help me. So she took me to this, goofball chiropractor who, told me that I had demons in my cells and then, sold us vitamins, essentially. So I think there's a lot around the world. There was then she took me to some other doctor who told me I was afraid of snakes and gave me a tuberculosis cure. And it's I'm not afraid of snakes. He was like, well, you don't think you're afraid of snakes, but you're afraid. I think that there's so much about spirituality and magic and, all of these beautiful energy forces and, rivers of energy in your body that connect to rivers, that is beautiful and true, and I feel that it is beautiful and true, and I also think it is just a way for people to take advantage of each other and to create lies. So I think part of I think sometimes people are like, oh, you should get acupuncture. I'm like, it's a lie. Like, I know it's not a lie. I know it really helps people. I just can't do it. Like, in the same breath that I sort of like dismiss spirituality, I'm like doing yoga, like meditating. I'm like writing poetry on leaves and scattering them in the wilderness. Yeah. Like, at the same time, I'm like, I'm not into this stuff.
Totally.
Yeah, so.
I actually wanted to ask you about where you're headed now that you have a solo career, but you're also a really big touring musician. And so I was wondering kind of where you're headed with that and what signal you're following in terms of collaborating.
That's such a complicated question. I love being a side woman. I love being a hired gun. I really do. I think that it's because I grew up playing only classical music. And in classical music, the whole idea is that you tell your story through somebody else's words, right? That it's like that you sing this song, that you play these notes on the piano, and that is your moment to create something that's true and personal about you, that like you become this channel of meaning, that you don't have to be the composer. And I think with popular music, a lot of times you feel like if I'm not the composer, if I'm not the creator of this thing, then it's not really art. And I don't feel that way. Like, I feel like when I'm, playing with iron and wine, that I'm being true and creative to myself, that I'm bringing myself to the music through his songs and adding something that's valuable and important. So, like, I feel fulfilled doing that. Like, I don't feel like, oh, I just have to, like, trudge through this world so that I can afford to live. But at the same time, it's just a really different process. It's very different to then go and make your own thing. It's been a while since I made the last solo record, and there were reasons why I didn't want to do it again. And not that I never wanted to do it again, but I needed to, like, not do it now. One of the reasons was that I had a hemorrhaged vocal cord for like a year, all of which I was working and just like having anxiety attacks all the time about it. Because I didn't want to tell anybody, because I didn't want to be fired, and because I love to sing. I also think, like, I don't think Sam would have fired me, but I think he would have been like, oh, you just don't sing on this one. But I love to sing.
Is that a painful situation?
It wasn't painful. It was just my voice would wear out. It would just run out, and then it would feel bad. It would feel weird. I think as a person who identifies as a singer, there is a spiritual thing that happens when you sing. And when you are singing and you feel distant from yourself, you lose that spiritual connection. Yeah. And that's really hard. That was a really hard thing. So there was this piece of, like, I can only use my voice for the things I'm required to do, and everything else I just don't have the voice to do it. So, like, when I would come home off of tour, I would just go on legit vocal rest. I would not, people would be like, oh, let's hang out, and I would make up excuses for, like, why we couldn't hang out. People would be like, oh, I want to come visit you on tour, like, let's have lunch. And I'd be like, oh, it's super busy today, I can't see you. And meanwhile, I would just be hiding from everybody because I'd be on vocal rest, which so that was a reason to not make music. And I think there's also, it's interesting being an artist where you are making something because you are compelled to make it. I think that's a thing that artists feel, that it's not a choice. It is a compulsion, that you feel lost and truly fucked up when you are not making things. But because I had this quilt project, I was not lost.
Oh, yeah.
I was, like, deeply fulfilled and connected and inspired and, like, reaching the end of my day feeling excited about the next day and the next thing I was going to do and the next woman I was going to be able to talk to and meet. So, for so long everybody knew me as a songwriter, and then I just stopped writing songs. But I feel that compulsion again. So I'm writing again, and I'm planning on recording and doing that thing where it's my own voice again.
Wow, yeah. That is so exciting.
Yeah.
I assume you would consider yourself a feminist.
Oh, yeah.
What does that mean to you? Because I read that one of your songs was about, is it Sinead O'Connor and Miley Cyrus?
Oh, yeah.
And I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit.
Being what I call an aggressive feminist is really important to me. And I think that we live truly in a deeply oppressive, patriarchal, white supremacist society. Yeah. And that creates a really complicated landscape for women, and I think especially women in the arts. And what happened with the Sinead O'Connor, Miley Cyrus thing was essentially like, basically Sinead O'Connor like wrote an open letter to Miley Cyrus where she was like, I love you and I care about you, but you are being used as a pawn by the men of the record industry, and your body has become a commodity, and you are being sold as a product by these men, and you are being manipulated by them, and you have a gift, and you are an artist, and you need to be strong and not be sexualized and diminished to your sexuality. And I think that's a big thing about women, is that we are so often diminished to our sexual identity, that is the one piece of ourselves that is approved by the male gaze. So it's like, you're allowed to be sexual, you're allowed to sell your sexuality, but everything else is secondary. And so Sinead wrote this letter to Miley being like, don't participate. And then Miley Cyrus basically wrote a letter back that was like, you are so patronizing and condescending, and how dare you take away my power and pretend like it's men who are sexualizing me. I'm sexualizing me because sexuality is the core of my identity, and it's so important to me, and like, I'm a sexual creature, and my nudity and my body and my, my sexual identity on stage is my art and is my voice. And I think that's really interesting. And like, I frequently have that debate in my own mind where I really intentionally do not want to participate in my own sexual identity in a public sphere. Like when I started playing with Grace Potter, who is very sexual, and I think her public commodification is very much based around her sexual identity and about her sexuality. And when I started playing for her, she said, I'm going to dress all of you guys. And she said to me, is there something that you would feel uncomfortable with? Like, what are you willing, what will you do? And I wrote her back and I said, I'm cool with anything. You're the boss. I'll wear what you want me to wear. No tits, no ass, no leather. Like, that was my thing. Like, you can't, like, I will sing your songs and I will wear what you want me to wear, but I will not be commodified as a sexual currency. And she was just like, sounds great. How about sequins? I was like, cool, I love you. But that was touring with Grace was a really interesting, it was that moment for me of like, I for so long had been on that Sinead side of like being fairly condescending about like, women allow themselves to be commodified and to become this like, sexual capital and like to be consumed for their bodies and for their sexuality in lieu of their talents or, whatever it was. And then I'm, spent 2 years with Grace, that is just who she is.
Right.
Like,
it's coming from
inside of her. So it's like, who am I to say like, you shouldn't be selling your sexuality? And it's like, why not? You can do whatever she wants. People like, so much of being an artist is selling your identity, is the commodification of your spirit for the consumption of others. And so it is hard for me. And I still like,
is that something to be ashamed about, or is that just part of the deal?
I don't know. I really don't know. Like, is it part of the patriarchy that like we've been conditioned to feel that that's something to lean into, and then a lot of times people are like, yeah, but like Mick Jagger is like commodifies his sexuality, it's not just about women, it's about men too. And fair enough. And but then I'm like, yeah, but that's part of it. It's like part of this, the male gaze of like, what is valuable, like what makes us valuable as human beings. And it is so important to me that my value not be connected to my sexual identity. And I think sometimes that becomes its own limiting factor where like, like, I think there was some time recently where I was like, oh, maybe I'll wear a dress. And then I knew I was going to have to be on stage. And I was like, well, I can't wear a dress on stage. I would never do that. Like, it becomes its own limiting factor where, like, I'm censoring myself because I think especially when I am on stage, I know that I'm being consumed by others. And I do not enjoy when men or women talk to me about my body. I am not interested in it. Like, there was one show recently, like on stage, I generally wear like a baggier shirt and skinny jeans, and I think I look super great.
Can attest that you do.
I think I look awesome. Like, I'm not saying like, and therefore I look like a garbage can. I think I look awesome. I just am trying to like not have my, my sexual body be part of that. But there, I was like backstage, and a guy came up to me and was like, I knew it. I knew you were sexy. I could see it. I could see it out there, like sexy librarian. And I had a friend, Tim, there with me, and he literally like put his body in between me and the guy and just like looked at me and was like, walk away, just walk away. And it was because like he was an important person. And he knew that, like, I was about to start yelling at this guy. Like, don't talk about my body. So I would say I am an aggressive feminist in that I really don't hold my tongue. And I think that, like, sometimes that is challenging for people. But, like, if you transgress, I will let you know.
Yeah, if that's challenging for you, you should be challenged.
Yeah. And I think even men and women who feel that they, believe in the equality of women are afraid of women and undervalue them or are, condescending or paternalistic. There's just a lot of ways in which that I am dealt with as a woman that it really bothers me, and I will let you know. And I think it's important to say that happens from women and men. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The sexualization thing happens more from men, and I think a lot of times men do it because they think it's nice. Like, it's a way of relating to me that I think they believe is kindness. And I really want them to know, like, this isn't kind. You are ignoring me. You are pretending that I don't exist, that only my sexual function exists for you. And that is a bummer. So it's hard. It's hard too. It's like, you're a good guy and you're nice. Like, it's not even like you're some monster.
Right.
Like, you're a good guy.
It just, like, unfortunately falls on you to educate someone. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Well, a big thing for me this last year has been boundaries and accepting that setting boundaries does not make me a bad person.
Yeah.
In relation to whoever I'm setting them with. And I feel like you're putting out such a strong signal of, like, fuck yes, boundaries.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, I really feel like, for the most part, like, it's received well, because most people aren't trolls. There are definitely trolls, and I know trolls, and they're impossible, but most people are nice, good people. And I think, and even people have challenged me about things that I have said, and I've had to be like, like, recalibrate. Like, you are participating in this thing. Don't participate. And learning how we participate in white supremacy, and learning how we participate in the patriarchy, that so much of it is so deeply ingrained in us that we're not always aware of it. And then, like, people get all fussy about, like, well, what can you do? It's like, everything that's not terrible. Like, there's a million ways to exist in the world without being horrible. Yeah.
Have you always stood in your identity as an artist and a woman? Have you always owned those, or has that been a journey?
No. I certainly, I think, have always stood in my identity as an artist. Definitely not stood in my identity as a woman at all. And that is a piece of my own journey that I find so complicated and interesting in a lot of ways, in which, like, I think I always identified as a feminist, and what that meant for me was that I didn't identify with traditional female characters. So I never liked dressing up in traditionally feminine ways. I have never worn makeup. I have never shaved my legs or my armpits. I like sports. I participate in organized sports. I had a hard time making friends with women, and most of my closest and dearest friends to this day continue to be men. I have a really strong and easy relationship with my dad, and a really strong and sometimes complicated relationship with my mom. Doesn't mean it's not strong or loving, it just is a little bit more complicated. And I think that as a young person, I took all of that input and all of that information to be a rejection of women. So I think that I was deeply misogynistic.
Wow.
Like deeply, deeply misogynistic. That my way in which I was trying to understand my own identity. And, I think now there's this whole, it's like, don't be the gender police. Like, boys are allowed to participate in all these different ways with their identity, and young girls are allowed to participate in all these ways with their identity. I think when I was growing up, I knew I didn't have gender dysmorphia. I'm not trans. I didn't identify as a man, but I identified as manly. So I cut all my hair off. I wanted to be a football player. I did all of those. I really leaned into what I understood as male identifying characteristics, which I think has served me in my adult life because I'm confident and I say what I mean, and I, all of these things that men benefit from, I benefited from. But it also meant that I did the same thing that men do, which was that I denied women's power, and I had no time for women's voices, and I thought women were weak and petty, and it's like, how horrible is that to say? That as a grown woman, that when I was 15, I was like, girls are stupid.
It's just such an incredible transformation to where you are now.
Yeah, it's wild. And coming to terms with oh my God, I hate women. Why do I hate women? I'm a woman. What?
What made you have to look at that?
Oh, I think some difficult public humiliation. I was in a friend group of lefty, progressive, artsy dudes who didn't understand how to relate to women and were afraid of women and wanted women to have sex with them, but didn't know how to make that happen, that kind of vibe. And so there was a real othering of women, and I think that the only way they could make sense then of me and my relationship to them and I'd lived with, my closeness with them, was to sort of rewrite my identity as a woman, and part of that was through a sort of ritual humiliation, which is really sad. And I think I'm not, looking back on it, I don't feel like I didn't have a hand in that. But also looking back on it, I'm like, why would I allow these things to happen to me? And I think some of them were just it's just regular teenage young adult hazing. And some of it's criminal behavior that's pretty creepy and sad. And I think it's sad that at the time I just registered it as a humiliation as opposed to an assault or as whatever it was, and I didn't know how to make sense of that. And I think I started to really develop some really powerful friendships with women who I really loved deeply, and that was really powerful for me to feel how different that felt. And then a really big part of it is that my husband is a real true feminist, and it's so weird to be part of my feminist education was from my man husband who would be this is not okay.
Wow. What a special person.
I know, and I'd be like, what are you talking about? He was more evolved than I was. I mean, it's a weird thing to say. I learned from a man how to be a good feminist, but I did. I feel I learned from a lot of really amazing women, and I think from my own awakening as a human being. I think, part of it is youth. You grow up and you have a better understanding of things. But part of it was meeting a really wonderful male energy that really celebrated female energy. And I think like gender identity is so complicated and interesting, so I think I'm more talking about energy, because you know,
yeah,
like that celebration of the feminine energy is a really important part of feminism, and that I learned from these, group of incredible women and from my lovely husband.
Yeah. It's that space for healing to be possible.
Yes. Yeah. And I think some of those friendships with some of those men from my past are like pretty, like, I'm okay with like not ever being friends with those people again. And some of those people I am still friends with. And it's like, how do we come to terms with like this history?
Yeah.
That we can acknowledge was like really fucked up.
Yeah. Do you have to acknowledge in order to move to something genuine?
What's been really interesting is like all this Me Too movement stuff started coming out. And I think for a lot of women, it was a really raw time because you had to re-examine things that I think most women accept a certain level of sexual humiliation, sexual assault, sexual harassment, having your work be diminished, to having, all of that stuff, you just accept it, and it just is so normal to your existence. And I think there was like sort of this lens put on it where you had to look back and be like, oh God. Like, oh, this thing that happened, and I just I just acted like it was normal. It's not normal, and it's horrible, and so I think I had a little bit of that reckoning of like, oh God, this thing that like in my mind I'm just thinking of as like a hazing ritual was actually like an assault that's like really fucked up. Like, how do I come to terms with this?
Yeah.
And in that time I had several of my friends like reach out to me and be like, I am so sorry. And and it's something it's not like of that thing I did to you last week. It's like, right. I am so sorry that this thing happened continually.
Yeah. We created a culture.
We created a culture where like this was the line, and we bounced up against that line over and over and over again, and I'm really sorry about it. And like it was interesting for me to like get these apologies and be like, I'm sorry too. Thank you for saying that, because it's like terrible and it haunts me. I say as I giggle, But it was nice. It was nice to hear that, like, that it wasn't just me who was looking back. That it was also, because again, I think, like, there are a lot of really wonderful men who just, are victims of the patriarchy, right? Like, like that's part of their journey too. It's part of their growth. It's part of their, and I'm not trying to, like, let evil off the hook. But I think there is a real shade. There's like the things that happen. There's like your Brock Scotts, where it's like, that is just straight up evil. That is like a horrible thing, and that man should be in jail. And then there's like these other things where you're like, it's pretty creepy, it's pretty terrible, but like I can still like see that you're like this beautiful human. I want you to be part of my life.
Yeah. And what is the greater context that behavior happened in?
Yeah. It's hard.
It's just the more we're talking, and I'm glad that everyone is talking about it now, but the more we talk, it really is just clear that everyone, like you're saying, everyone has these experiences.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And every once in a while, I'll talk to a woman who's like, I've never been sexually harassed. And then I'll like ask them a question, and they'll be like, oh, well, that happened. I'm like, okay, well then yes.
Right.
Like, yes, you have.
Right. It's like educating each other about what we deserve, and yeah. Well, where do you see yourself, in the greater context, but also just in yourself and in your voice? Like, what are the things that you care about moving forward?
Well, I mean, the quilt project I'm working on right now, like, I feel really passionate about it as the idea of like being able to shine a light on women's contribution to cultural identity, and to also, we started this podcast maybe saying I'm a textile artist, which is what I say when I want you to take me seriously, but I'm a quilter. That there is so much about craft art and about, naive or rudimentary music or folk music that we sort of dismiss, and often we dismiss those things because they are of the provenance of women. And that, in the quilting movement, it's like the 70s art quilts come on and people are like, oh, quilting is a real art form, but it's because those quilts were made by men. So I mean, now there are art quilters who are women, and there are quilts that are acknowledged as art quilts that were made by women. But a big part of that movement was just like, men are doing it now. How do we understand this? Oh, it's an art form.
Wow.
It's like, okay. Wah, wah.
I did not realize that.
Yeah, so I feel like part of the story I'm trying to tell right now is that what we understand as fine art and folk art, and as music that is art and music that is craft, music that is important and music that is trash, that like all of those things deserve some examination, and that all of that contributes to these lenses of how we identify ourselves and how we understand ourselves and the world we live in. And I hope, in some way that there's like an element of peace to my project, it being sort of this like Russia-United States thing. The amazing thing is I started this project before the Trump election.
Right.
So to me, it was this like, oh, we can like re-examine this relationship that is so complex and interesting, and in the new context of, just kidding. Same context of, empires at war with each other. One of the amazing things that happened when I was in Russia was I gave this lecture up in Murmansk at a cultural festival, and some quilters came to the lecture, and many of which were older women. And this probably 75-year-old woman came up to me afterwards and through a translator said, it's just so nice to see you here and to hear you talk about, traditions, because here it's like Americans are just so scary, and we're it's just what you see in the news, it's just all so horrifying and so terrible, and like how wonderful to just see you and your smiling face. And I wanted to be like, we're not scary, you're scary. Like, you guys are the ones like punching bears, poisoning people on park benches. And it's good to be reminded that like people everywhere are beautiful and unique and exactly the same, and totally different and exactly the same and totally different. So I hope that this project and the culmination of this project will give me an opportunity to kind of tell that story, that, there is beauty and value in all of these places that we're not looking.
Yeah. Well, your music certainly does that for me. So
Thank you.
Where can people find quilts and music?
I have a website, elizahardyjones.com. I will post the quilt events. I have some super exciting exhibitions coming up, which I can't say what they are yet because they're not like announced. But I have those things coming up in the next year and a half, which are really exciting, and I'm really excited to be working specifically towards those exhibitions and the performances that will happen at those exhibitions. And then I'm going to make a new record this year, and that'll come out at some point. So,
yay!
Yeah.
Oh, I can't wait.
Thanks.
Thank you for sharing so much of your journey.
Thank you for talking to me. It was really fun, and it like opened things up in a way I didn't think it was going to.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
I am tired, I am cold, I am angry. And I close my eyes and pretend you're never with me. I'm a liar, I'm a fraud, I'm a criminal at heart, and I steal myself for the fall, but I'm already in the dark. Take off your clothes and be the ghost they want you to be. Take off your clothes and let them see you're just a ghost. Take off your clothes and let them see you're just a ghost.
Thanks for hanging again with us, sweet friends. Isn't Eliza the best? I'm going to play one more of her songs. That was Criminal, inspired by Sinead and Miley. And coming up is Because Become, the title track from her 2016 album. You can, of course, find me, as always, at maurajames.com and on Instagram at maurajames and unbroken.chain. I'd love to hear from you if you have art to share, people to share, adventures to share. Be good to each other out there. Be kind to yourselves. I'm wishing you all the magic in 2019, and I'll see you again next week.